I'm going to elaborate a bit more on the topics that I started in the morning, which is the FPAS Mark II, more the policy-oriented part of it. And I'll start with the first claim that I made in the morning, which is that if you look at the forecasting performance of the central banks around the world, this is terrible. And on the screen, you can see the 4 countries: Sweden, Norway, Czech Republic, and New Zealand. So these are all very well respected institutions with a very good human capital. And you can see these are the spaghetti charts, which means the rolling forecasts of the repo rates. Okay, all institutions are important because they publish their interest rate paths. That's why also one of the reasons that we have this chart. And you can see that it's quite clear that in all cases, the expectations of the which were baked in the baseline for the interest rates are very, very far from what happened in the real life. So this was the first part. You can construct this graph for inflation. You can construct this graph for GDP. You would have a very similar pattern. And if you look at, and of course, there are very good stories that we can tell underneath each of these forecast error. And you can see that, for example, after 2009, 2010, constantly everybody was expecting that interest rates will normalize very quickly and inflation problem will go away very quickly. That's why you can see that these red lines were always going back to some kind of a neutral rate that they had. In fact, that's not what happened. So this is one of these key things that we want to start with, that if you base all your policy on this kind of forecast, that's not a good strategy, because at the end of the day, this will work great until it doesn't work. And this was the claim that I made, that forecasting performance and forecasting ability has very little to do with the actual policy. So policy is more of a risk management rather than just guessing what will happen. Now, that is why the main question that we came up with when we're talking about the need for the new framework is really, so what are the key, let's say we have this open thinking, and a world has been created today, and we want to design from scratch a new policy framework. So what would be the attributes that together we would like to have? And the new policy framework had to recognize 2 important facts. Fact number 1, I already mentioned, which is that central banks are really, really bad at forecasting. And the second one is that, which is related to the first one, is that in fact the world is not linear. In fact, the places where we are hitting the uncertainty, there are actually very important nonlinearities, which can take away the economy to the so-called dark corners. Dark corners is the term that Olivier Blanchard coined. He was thinking about, for example, the effective lower bound issue, deflationary traps, and these kind of situations in emerging markets. For example, when you talk about dark corner, it's actually the opposite. Usually people think about dark corners in emerging markets that too much inflation, it's the hyperinflation scenarios where basically inflation expectations get de-anchored, right? So the point is that, when you want to have when you know that there are these kind of nonlinearities, so your economy can actually go into this very dangerous territory, you want to have a framework which makes sure that it guards the economy from getting to these points, right? So the real reason that this is important, because it shifts the focus from trying to, find out the optimal path along the road to the other point, which is you are trying to make sure that your economy, the accuracy is not the key here. The technical details is the important thing. You don't get to these dark corners. So you want to put the point of the policy is not to accurately calibrate everything so that everything goes perfect, but it actually, especially during uncertain times, the role is to make sure that you are out of this dark corner. So these were the 2, ingredients or preconditions that we wanted our new policy framework to recognize. Now, if you look at the central banks, which have a consistent monetary policy framework, in FPAS Mark I as well. Usually, if you look at their projections or their communications and the way they communicate about their policy, there is always, in each scenario, there is a three questions that they usually try to address. And I want this to be sort of entrenched in our thinking in terms of consistent thinking about scenarios. And the first one is where is the economy now? So when we communicate the market, it's really important to tell what do we think is the state of the economy now, which means, are we in an overheating economy, or are we in the economy there is excess capacity? So this kind of thinking is really important to explain the markets in terms of the inflationary pressures today. Second thing is the forward-looking part, which is what do we think might be driving the economy in the medium run, so in the horizon, which means that we want to communicate to the markets what are the main forces that are going to be important in shaping the scenarios that we think. And the third one, which is probably the most important one, is we want to communicate what do we do with our policy instruments to achieve our basic policy objective under the assumptions of number one and number two. So why is this important? Because remember what I was telling in the morning is that the key role of monetary policy communication and monetary policy is really to explain the markets what is the role of monetary policy in actually achieving the inflation objectives. And I know it sounds a bit strange that I mentioned this, but many central banks and many very known central banks don't do this. They actually do the opposite. They somehow assume that the inflation will go back to the target on its own without actually recognizing this endogenous nature of the policy. That's why if you look at the scenarios now in the FPAS Mark II, the ingredients that we want to have in the scenarios, because we're talking about scenarios, so we have to define what are the good characteristics of good scenarios. Is that first we call these 3 R's. The first is related to the current data. Okay, so when we talk about the scenario, we want to make sure this is something which is related to the actual developments. Okay, so it cannot be the very outworldish. It has to be something which is related to the current data. It has to be realistic, which means there again, we need to make sure that we can convince internal and external stakeholders that this is something which has a significant probability of happening. Okay, so it's something which is worth talking about. And the third one is going to be relevant for policy. Okay, this is something which has to do with monetary policy. So see, these are the 3 simple ingredients that we're thinking about as the characteristics of the scenarios. Now, okay, so now, as I mentioned, these 3 things sound very simple. They sound something is obvious, but I want to show you that as obvious as it sounds, there are actually central banks which do not do this. And the first one is actually the Bank of England case. If you look at the case of the Bank of England, you can see on the right-hand side the graph, which is the projection of the CPI inflation based on constant interest rates at 1%. This is an excerpt from their monetary policy report of August 2022. This is an intentional pause, so you can. I'm trying to see if you can find the cracks in this graph. Do you recognize anything irregular or strange in this graph? Well, the point is that I was talking about the endogenous nature of the monetary policy, and I want to read the title of chart 1.8: CPI inflation projection based on constant interest rates at 1% and other policy measures as announced. Okay, so if you look at it, what's happening is that the interest rates are exogenous. Inflation starts from 6%. It somehow magically goes to 12.5 or 13%. And under the constant interest rate, the monetary policy doesn't do anything. And inflation lives its own life, and it goes back to the target in a very magical way. Right? So the reason I'm bringing this up, because this is why it's very important to think about scenarios in this framework, in this simple framework, because the key component number 3, which is what do we need to do with our policy instruments to achieve our basic policy objectives, is actually present sorry, is actually absent from the communication that Bank of England does, right? And it's actually the opposite message to the market, which means that inflation somehow, the problem of inflation will somehow get solved without any policy action, right? So this is why this is so important to recognize. So this is why the simple stuff that I'm talking about, we can never take it as given, and I can, if we can sit down together someday and go over different communication devices in different central banks. Trust me, you'll find lots of things like this there. Okay, that is why we want to start with the simple principles. Okay, so by the way, if you look at the left-hand side, there is a there is something which we call it, we also mentioned, which is the Taylor principle, which basically essentially tries to make sure that the interest rates are endogenous and react strongly enough to bring inflation back to the target. Okay, so it's just one example of having a Taylor principle. It's just one example to avoid this exogenous interest rate path assumption. Okay, so now, what is a good way of communicating what's the good way of the conventional forward guidance? And we call this conventional forward guidance because Cameron explained very well in the morning different types of forward guidance, but basically conventional forward guidance, as we call it, is the situation where central bank communicates the interest rate path in a consistent way. So it communicates the whole that is just one scenario that it communicates with the markets and it considers, and in that particular way, this is not really a promise of any kind of interest rate path going forward, but this is really a conventional way of consistent communication of the future interest rate path. Now, if you look at this, so what's the good example? If you look at the Czech National Bank, and this is the case of 2008, 2008 second quarter. Remember, this was the time that the global financial crisis was starting to happen, and everybody was starting to realize that there's something serious going on. And you can see what was happening there. If you look at the headline inflation, which is the top left-hand chart, you can see there that inflation was very high. So your target was 3%. And then the inflation, the headline inflation, was around 6.5, so very high inflation. And we know that part of it was due to commodity prices, because remember, these were the times that oil prices were around $150, so commodity prices were going up. If you look at the real GDP growth also was quite high, was around 5%. And if you look at the monetary policy relevant inflation, which is some kind of a measure of the core inflation, okay, which filters out these components like oil and energy and food, and you can see that even the monetary policy relevant inflation was quite high. It's bottom left-hand chart, and you can see it was around 4.55%. So again, much higher than the inflation target. And you can see in that particular case, what happened is that they cut the interest rates. Okay, so everything is, very high GDP growth, inflation initial conditions, both monetary policy relevant and headline are very high, and they cut the interest rates. So how can one actually pull off this kind of trick? Is a very interesting question, right? Because you can imagine what would happen in any of your countries if you were in this situation and you suddenly cut the interest rate. And the simple answer is that you can actually pull this off if you can have a very good explanation why are you doing this. And the very good explanation here is, of course, the forward-looking nature and the conventional way of forward guidance that Czech Republic was conducting, which is they basically explain the market that they see there's serious signs of crisis coming in. So if you look, yes, it's true that today, we have a bit of an overheated economy, inflation is high, but going forward, we see that there is going to be a big storm. So that actually allowed them to do the right thing at the right time, even though it was very, very difficult to communicate. Okay, so that's why you can see, and they actually published this graph with the interest rates going down and then normalizing. Now, you can see here the comparison of the Czech Republic with some other countries. So the purple is the you can see the circle. The purple is the episode that I mentioned, and you can see that the Czech Republic cut the interest rates. Whereas if you look at, for example, the green line, which is the euro area, at ECB they actually increased the interest rates because inflation was very high, but mainly we think it's because they just didn't have this consistent way of communication, consistent way of forward guidance, thinking about the policy. So they just reacted to the current circumstances and current conditions when the storm was actually coming. Okay, so the point and the lesson here is that if you think about scenarios in a consistent way that I have described, okay, it actually the communication becomes a very strong tool for you rather than a constraining factor. So it completely shifts the mindset, because you don't think of a communication as something, you know, which you may get into a trouble and all this kind of stuff. It's actually the opposite, because in this particular circumstance, as I showed you, it allowed the central bank to do the right thing in a very difficult situation. Okay, so that's the value of having a good framework. Okay, and this is the where ECB actually increased the interest rates, and you can see that the ECB actually had to decrease the interest rates after the Lehman crisis. You can see that they had to cut the interest rates quite drastically afterwards. Okay, now if you look at this, this is also very organically connected to the transparency of central banks. Because you know, I mentioned before that, you know, internal communication, external communications, and accountability and transparency, these are very closely interrelated concepts. And usually, if you have a good framework, it allows you to be more transparent. And you know, as in case of the Czech National Bank, of course, I showed you that they basically communicated with the market very clearly all the main macroeconomic indicators and the policy indicators going forward. And this was important for them, for their policy actions. So transparency actually helped them. And this is a chart which was combined, basically combined by ICADAC and you know, the co-authors, which looks at the transparency indicators, which look at the individual central banks very, very carefully. Okay, and having in mind this inflation targeting framework. Okay, and you can see here that FPAS central banks, so the central banks which think about the policy in a systemic manner that I just described, these three ingredients that I mentioned, they end up to be in a higher transparency angle. So their transparency is actually much higher. Again, because transparency is aligned with their policy objectives. Okay, this is the important message. One thing that I wanted to mention also about this transparency work that we are doing, and we are continuing, we will be continuing to do it for the FPAS Mark II as well. It's really important when you think about transparency in terms of compiling different indices. You know, there is always a trade-off, because if you want to cover many countries, at some point you sort of become mechanical. So you look what is written in the laws, you know, what is everybody saying. And you in many cases, you actually lose the essence, which is how the policy is actually conducted. I think one of the key advantages of this work, it actually goes very deeply, in many cases, with interviewing the officials of the central bank into actual policy. Okay, so under each of these transparency scores, the authors know exactly what's going on in that particular central bank. And I assure you, if you do it, you know, just looking at the laws and what's written in the official document, and you actually look what's happening in real life, you get very different results. So this is one thing that I wanted to emphasize. Now, so another thing which I mentioned, remember the second ingredient of the FPAS Mark II, like what is the framework that we want to have, is the folly of baselines and local approximations, which means that the, you know, like, why is it dangerous to assume that things are going linear? And you know, why is it that, you know, if you assume these kind of things, that the probability of getting into these dark corners that I mentioned is actually much higher? And what happens is that, to show you the simple example, basically think about local approximations method. assume linearity. It means from point A to point B, you just go through the direct channel, right? So it's just a straight road, no problem. Okay, this is what Vazgen probably meant, like normal times in the morning. Unfortunately, the world is not like this. The world is actually more like this. And the point is that if you want to go from point A to point B, and you assume that you have all these local approximations, you inevitably drive into the woods, and it's not a very pleasant situation. Okay, that's why you don't want to have these baseline forecasts which assume that the world is linear and things are just going to be very gradual. Okay, because first you are going to send these false assurances to the market that everything is always going to be as it was before. We know best. The central bank somehow has this magic head it wears and knows exactly what's going on. So these are all these convoluted and negative messages we think that you are going into if you don't deal with these issues. And I gave you a couple of examples in the case of Armenia, but we know exactly what happened in the August of 2021 in the US. Very similar situation, and arguably last several years, even after the global financial crisis, we were constantly observing these kind of situations that everybody was assuming that things just will just become normal on their own. Okay, and the initial charts that I showed you were very, very similar. So to dig deeper in the internal processes that I mentioned in the morning, right? So why do we think that this approach is going to generate lots of efficiency gains? Okay, and the first one that I mentioned in the morning is really that it eliminates the consensus seeking. Okay, so I mentioned that the baseline, if you have something called baseline, it immediately creates so much pressure in the institutions to seek some consensus around just one line, which is so inefficient because it's just impossible. And at the end of the day, everybody is becoming very unhappy because nobody has their perfect line of their mind. Board thinks, staff is imposing some lines on them. Staff thinks, board doesn't trust them. So this is all these unintended consequences when you think about this. Whereas if you have these several scenarios and everybody is free to imagine what would be the policy relevant scenarios, 3 R's that I mentioned, it immediately converts all this energy from consensus seeking, rather finding out what are the relevant scenarios which are important to communicate to the market. The second thing is, I didn't talk about this in the morning, so it's a good chance for me to elaborate, is the leverages the brain power of all the board members. Okay, so this is, I know it sounds very cryptic, but I can explain. So what happens is the following. Usually, what happens when you try to, when you are in the environment that there's lots of debates around the baseline forecast, what happens is, usually the good debaters who can communicate very well, who can sound very convincing, good debaters usually win. So, and good debaters are not always the best thinkers, are not always the people who know more or have more to put to the table. But this is the system, how the system is wired. Okay, so if you can debate well, it means that you will have more effect on the policy because you'll have more effect on this how the baseline is formed, and so you will have good debaters systemically affecting the policy. And on the other hand, you will have very people who can actually bring a lot to the policy, but let's say they're introverts, they don't like to talk too much like I do. Okay, and then so they're unhappy, and we don't, as a institution, we don't really utilize their brain power. Okay, now in the system that I mentioned, because you make everybody thinking about scenarios and you eliminate this unproductive debating around baseline seeking, now everybody's incentives are actually opposite, because now everybody's seeking to find what are the right scenarios. And so you can actually leverage the brain power of the board members who actually don't have these very good debating skills, or they're just different personality types. These are very important. By the way, in my own experience, this was always the complaints that I was getting from board members that I'm interviewing. So more like a low-key board members who didn't like to talk too much. They were always complaining about these kind of things. Because exactly, for example, especially the board members who were working in that institutions for a long time, where we have been in the management positions before, they have a very strong advantage when doing the policy. So this, I think, is also very good in that sense, because it completely changes the internal procedures. Okay, so related to this is the third point, which is the prioritizing the alternative thinking. Okay, here again, it's very important, because when you create these incentives to think about scenarios, okay, it's really important that everybody consciously tries to think about what would be the scenarios, what would be the alternative thinking that will help the policymakers to make the good judgment, because this is again fundamentally about the risk management. You don't think about just one scenario, so you think about the risk management. So it makes you to think about the risks, okay, consciously. That's why it's so important. The fourth one, I mentioned it about again a couple of minutes ago, the sense of ownership of the board. Here again, when you have the board, you have the baseline, where the staff prepares the baseline. Most of the cases, board doesn't feel that this baseline is something they own. They feel this is something that the forecasting team basically just imposes on them. Okay, and in reality, this is something that the forecasting team wants to do. It's just the way it's actually wired in the system, because they spend lots of time in actual technical work and creating these baseline scenarios. And at the end of the day, it's just very difficult to change. You just have to seek some consensus. Okay, so the real life is not that romantic. Real life is, have this kind of aspects. That's why if you make the board the owner of this, where they can actually individually also, in case of Armenia, because we have this, we don't have this consensus seeking mechanism in our legislation. So they actually feel the ownership, because their views on the scenarios are explicitly in the decision making, okay, without being in this particular scenario. So, and the last two are, of course, consequences of what I was saying, because now if you eliminate this consensus seeking and fighting each other for the right baseline scenario, that immediately unleashes the energy into the more culture of debate and discussion, because now the system is wired in a way that you discuss the different scenarios. So I think this is where I wanted to end. And I don't know, do we have time for a Q&A, Doug, or you want to continue? Okay, so you talked about the HR issues. So this is what I wanted to say, emphasizing the internal, sort of the real life aspects of the decision making, which I think is more or less really resembles what's happening in the central banks around the world.